Jim, as a once angry atheist, something about the Gospels struck you as being more than, and I quote you, moralistic mythologies. They actually appear to be ancient eyewitness accounts, and that very fact became important to you. Why?
I think because when I first started, I was just interested in Jesus' words. So if it had been just a list like the Gospel of Thomas, a list of the quotes of Jesus, the kind of proverbial wisdom of Jesus, that would be one kind of document. But of course, the Gospels aren't that at all. The Gospels appear to be recording a series of events that include Jesus' words, but they appear to be a historical account. And that's a very different proposal altogether. That means that if it is history, if it's a claim about something that actually happened, it means it's falsifiable. In other words, it's like my cold cases. I have people who will say, hey, I saw this is what happened, and they give me a narrative. Well, I can actually go in and take a look and see if that's reliable. Is that true? Did it actually happen? Is it falsifiable? And that gives me a point of context, a point of reference to begin an investigation. You'd have a hard time doing that if, for example, all we have was the Gospel of Thomas, a series of proverbial statements for the most part from Jesus. We'd have a really hard time even doing any kind of an historical investigation to see if it actually occurred. But these don't have that kind of contextual feeling. As I read through them, I saw they had properties that were similar to the properties of eyewitnesses when you have more than one witness to see in an event. When you have multiple eyewitness accounts, they have a certain characteristic, a certain flavor. And at first, as I read through these, I didn't really put my finger on what it was about them. I have in the book, but for me, my gut instinct as an investigator said, wow, that's interesting. I've seen that before in a robbery. I've seen that before in a homicide account. So it just caused me to take the next step. I think we're blessed as Christians that we don't believe something that's not rooted in history. We believe something that had to actually occur. As Paul said, if the resurrection didn't actually occur in history, we're to be pitied. They're lying as eyewitnesses, he says. We're a lie. It's all a lie. And that's the beautiful thing about Christianity, is it's something you can actually investigate. I'm grateful for that because as an investigator, that's exactly how I...
Jim, let me read a quote that you make in your book. If I had good reason to believe that the Gospels were reliable eyewitness accounts, I was going to have to deal with the stuff I had always resisted as a skeptic. Here's my question. Is it possible to become a Christian because of the evidence rather than in spite of the evidence?
Let me be careful how I answer. I think that from my own experience, this is what I experienced, and so I can only explain to you from my perspective. It's clear that God does something first, and He called me to this. He removed the hostility I had, because I'm going to tell you, my hostility was not really evidential resistance at first. It's that I didn't want there to be a God that would change my life in a dramatic way. I was happy being my own God. You know, the God of Jim was big enough in my world. I was fine with that. And the God of Jim also got to decide what was right and what was wrong. It was really a volitional position I was in. I had a certain dislike of God that I didn't want to even look at the evidence fairly. But I think what God does first is He opens the door so the evidence can be seen in a way that for me, if you'd approached me with this evidence a year before, I don't know that it would have had the same impact on me. I think what happens is that at some point, and we each have to examine, has it happened for us? Are we actually at a place where we can now look at the evidence? Has God done something in our lives to move us to a place where we can see the evidence, that it's all His evidence anyway? God does not use evidence, it's a means. I hope that it's the means by which God introduced me to the gospel. In the end, I'm a detective. I'm a skeptical detective. That's who I am. I had to enter through the evidence. The great thing about my belief in Christianity is I'm not finding evidences I have to ignore. There's not a bunch of evidence on the table I have to ignore in order to accept this. It turns out God is the God of truth. He called me and then provided me with all this evidence to verify the very things He's making claims about. It's all God's world, and it turns out everything in Scripture resonates truly with everything outside of Scripture. And once I realized the connection between these two things, it made a sense for me. Not that I am on my own able to examine this evidence. Oh, I'm so smart, I can figure this out. Not at all. It's that God does something first, and then I'm able to use the evidence that God has provided to actually make a case.
Jim, you personalize a phrase which reads, a belief that to a belief in. Explain what you mean.
Yeah, I first saw it in John 3 when Nicodemus comes to Jesus and tells him that, you know, we all believe that you're a wise teacher, you're a great teacher. And he believed that something was true. And Jesus in the end says it's belief in me that actually saves you. And so if you read through the entire chapter 3 of John, it's very compelling for me. And I saw it in action in my own life. In a case I worked many years ago, working as an officer-involved shooting investigation, we get called out for those too. If an officer gets involved in shooting, the homicide team comes out to take a look and see how this went down. And the officer will typically walk you through the shooting scene. And a particular officer was involved in a shooting. He pulled over what he thought was a drunk driver. And as he got the drunk driver out of the car, it turned out to be much worse than he had first anticipated. The driver was actually a parolee who did not want to go back to jail and was carrying a handgun in his waistband. So as he got the drunk driver out of the car and turned him around and started his field sobriety test, and the driver actually turned on him and pointed that handgun at the officer's chest. And the officer knew that he was at a critical moment, and he was behind the curve time-wise. This guy had drawn on him and was pointing that gun just a little bit further than you and I are in distance. And so for him, it was the first time he had to really make a decision. All along as young officers, we're trained that our vest will stop around. We see shoot tests, we see vests that are shot at, we can see what kinds of rounds they stop. So we believe that the vest can save us. But in that one moment, this officer had to move from belief that to belief in, because he told me, he just said, I just tensed my stomach muscles and I figured I'm just gonna take the first round. I can't do anything about this. I don't even have my hand on my gun. I'm just going to have to take this first round. And he had to, for the first time, trust in his vest, a vest that he knew could save him, but for the first time had to trust in it to do the very thing he believed that it could do. And that's when you really move. And I think for most of us as people, we don't, even as Christians, we don't go anywhere or do anything that causes us to stretch outside our comfort zone and see, is God in this? Can I trust God for this? Can I move in a way that causes me to have to trust in something? And for me, certainly, I first developed a belief that the Gospels were reliable, but that's not going to be sufficient. At some point, I've got to decide, am I willing to trust that vest with my life? Am I willing to believe, am I so convinced by this, by the sufficiency of this vest, that I'm willing to just tense my stomach muscles and take the first round? And that's what we have to do, I think, when we start to examine the Gospels. We're going to ask ourselves, is there enough good reason to believe that we can actually trust this and trust this with our lives?
Can you give me an example of a New Testament chain of custody dealing with, let's say, the Apostle John?
Yeah, I think I've tried to look at and looked for all the gospel writers, but the ones that are the strongest are John, Mark's gospel, if you accept the fact that it's from Peter, and I think you can make a case for that. But John's a good example, for example. John's the eyewitness at the scene. He's kind of like the officer who's at the scene of the crime, who's got some piece of evidence, and he's going to have to collect it now, and he doesn't even know that 30 years from now it's going to go to trial. If that officer does a good job, he photographs it where it is, he takes it, he kind of signs for it, collects it properly, signs it into property, gives it to the property officer who holds it and signs for it and keeps it in custody and then gets it back out. Maybe some photographs will be taken along the way while it's in property. Then he's going to sign it out to a detective who will sign it into a criminalist who will sign it out to a detective who will sign it into court. That's our chain of custody. Well, John's got a similar approach. He writes something. And then he has 3 students, Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias. We still have the writings of Ignatius and Polycarp. And so we can look at those writings as a Polaroid of sorts, a snapshot of that ancient piece of evidence, the testimony of John, and see if it's already, did John really call out Jesus as a miracle-working Son of God who rose from the dead? Maybe John just described Jesus as a simple rabbi teacher, somebody who's an itinerant preacher. No, we want to see what the first Polaroid looks like. And we can actually look at it in the writings of Papias and Ignatius. Now, who's the next person they hand it to in the chain of custody? Well, they've got a student named Irenaeus. Who does he hand it to? Well, he's got a student named Hippolytus. So I think we can look at this and say, what is the snapshot that's taken by John, by Ignatius, by Irenaeus, by Hippolytus? And we can follow it down toward the actual courtroom, which is the Council of Laodicea, where it's finally they lay it out. This is what the Gospels we can trust are. Okay, so this is, I think, is so important about the chain of custody. If we look at those early Polaroids of Jesus, you're stuck with the same Jesus that we know and love today. If we lost the writings of all the Gospel writers, if we lost all the work of John and Mark and Matthew and Luke, you just had the first generation of Polaroid takers, the disciples who studied under those men, you'd be stuck with the exact same Jesus we have today, the miracle-working Son of God who rose from the dead.